Afternoon. This is the call to order for the County of Santa Clara Planning Commission. Will the clerk please call the roll? And this is for June 13th, 2019.
Chairperson Schmidt.
Here.
Vice Chairperson Rouser.
Present.
Commissioner Moore. Commissioner Resendez. Commissioner Gill.
Here.
Commissioner Levy.
Here.
Commissioner Escobar, absent. You have a quorum.
Thank you. Please stand if you are able to join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you. My name is Kathy Schmidt. I'm the chair of the County Planning Commission, and on behalf of the entire commission, welcome to today's meeting. The intent of today's meeting is for the Planning Commission to consider a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors regarding the proposed Stanford General Use Permit and related actions and approvals. Today is the second of 3 scheduled hearings by the Planning Commission on the Stanford General Use Permit. After today's hearing, there is a scheduled hearing on June 27th at 1:30 p.m. at the County Government Center. And if needed, we also will have a meeting on July 1st, also here at 1:30. For today, we'll follow a format similar to the format that we had in Palo Alto on May 30th. The staff will first make a presentation to the Commission regarding the project and the department's recommendations and updates from last week, or from 2 weeks ago. During this presentation, the Commission members may have questions of staff. At the end of this presentation, we will open the meeting for public comments. The project applicant will be first and will be allotted 10 minutes. The Commission may ask questions of the applicant, but it will not affect the applicant's time allotment. I'll then call upon other speakers who will be allotted like 2 minutes today. It looks like we have fewer than 30 speakers, so then we'll be allotted 2 minutes. And the Commission may also ask questions of the speakers. When testimony is finished, I'll allow the applicant 5 minutes for a response, and then we'll close the public hearing. No more testimony will be allowed after the hearing is closed. For those of you who wish to speak today, please fill out a request to speak card. The cards are located in back, and when you have completed it, please bring it up to the front. There's a plastic container up on this little sidewall where you can put the cards. And again, as last time, please note that public speakers can speak at one or all of the public hearings we have scheduled for the Stanford General Use Permit. Please note that today's meeting is being filmed and will be available to watch from a link on the county's website. The next meeting on June 27th also will be filmed, and if there is a July meeting, it will be filmed too. Please note that all Stanford speakers who are associated with the general use permit application must fit their remarks within the 1 10-minute time frame allotted to Stanford. The other public speakers can include anyone who works or studies at Stanford but is not associated with the Stanford GUP application. A couple of final reminders to the audience. Please remember to turn off your cell phones and pagers. I want to remind everyone to be respectful of each speaker and allow all to finish without any interruptions from anyone who is not speaking. And please do not speak or clap or cheer or boo from the audience because we want, again, everyone to finish without interruptions and be respected. Please direct your comments to the project that is the subject of tonight's meeting. However, we still will start with public comment, which is item number 3 on the agenda. And this item is reserved for persons desiring to address the Commission on any matter within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Commission that is not on this agenda. Members of the public who wish to address the Commission on any item not listed on the agenda should again complete the request to speak form and place it in the plastic container. And I will call on individuals to speak in turn. And speakers are limited to 3, 2, or 1 minute, depending on how many there are. The law does not permit commission action or extended discussion of any item not on the agenda except under special circumstances. If commission action or response is requested, the commission may place the matter on a future agenda. Statements that require a response may be referred to staff for reply in writing. And at this point, I have no one who wants to speak in the public comment period. So then we will move on to item number 4. And this is a continued public hearing from May 30th, 2019, item number 4, to consider the following: Stanford University General Use Permit, GUP, application, Stanford GUP Environmental Impact Report, EIR, Stanford University Community Plan Amendments, and Zoning Ordinance Amendments. Location, Stanford University Community Plan Area, zoning, A1, general use, R1S, low-density campus residential, R3S, medium-density campus residential, OS/G, open space and field research, SCA, special conservation area, Supervisorial District 5, file numbers ELN 98-7165, paren 7165-98P-99GP-99EIR, paren, and PLN 16-7165, paren 7165-16P-16GP-16Z-16EIR, paren, ID number 97428. Now, I would like to ask the staff to begin their presentations to us.
Good afternoon, Sylvia Gallegos, Deputy County Executive. Before we begin the formal presentation, I wanted to make a couple of observations. Number one, we wanted to underscore the fact that the administration is in fact recommending approval of this $3.5 million development proposal, and that we do believe it's a sustainable project if conditioned as staff recommends. And we wanted to make that point at the beginning because we didn't want to get lost when we are immersed in the details of this application. The second thing that I wanted to speak to, and this continues the comments that I made on May 30th, is that, and in particular reflecting upon comments of a couple of commissioners with respect to a development agreement. As you'll recall, on May 30th, I indicated that for the entire history of the county, we have undergone the process that we have before you today, which is to review the application, consider the environmental mitigations and conditions, and make recommendations to the board. Again, last year, the board approved a development agreement, the general use of it as a tool, and it is something that's available as a tool for the county. An update with respect to the status, as we said last time, the negotiations are suspended at the moment. If or when the county re-enters negotiation, it will be done at a time that's most strategically advantageous to the county. I want to emphasize that point, and that the Planning Commission still has a job before it, which is to do what you've done for the last 169 years, review this applications and make your recommendations. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Bradley, who will commence with the formal staff presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Schmidt, members of the Planning Commission. I'm Jeff Bradley, Consulting Project Manager for this Stanford General Use Permit project. In addition to our county staff here at the table, in the first row behind me, we have a number of consultants available as needed, and we will introduce them if we ask them to step forward to help out with questions. Today is the second of 3 public hearings planned for this project before the Planning Commission. We have a presentation focused on key issues today with a pause in the middle for questions. As a general overview of the proposed project before you, the request is for 3.5 million square feet of net new academic development, including 2,600 student beds. That's the core of the development request. This would also include 550 faculty and staff housing units as proposed in the original application. We'll get into some recent developments on the housing front later in the presentation, but this is being faithful to the existing application filed back in 2016. 40,000 square feet of childcare and trip reduction space. This would be space that would be in addition to the main development request that would be earmarked for that use only. And 50,000 square feet of what's known as temporary surge space to facilitate the creation of new buildings and renovation of existing buildings without disrupting the workflow unnecessarily. So as I mentioned, we really want to focus down on three main issues that have been raised by the public throughout this public process, raised as significant concerns by both members of the public as well as surrounding jurisdictions. These are the serious housing issues that burden the area, the concern about ever worsening traffic congestion, and the future of the open space within the Stanford foothills. These issues have been addressed through the application of existing policy through this process that the county is fortunate to have, including community plan policies such as the housing linkage policy, the provision of housing for all target populations within the community plan area, substantial sustainable development goals, trip reduction goals and standards within the community plan, zoning ordinance standards, county housing ordinances, as well as the longstanding 1985 land use policy agreement that lays out the central ground rules for how the county and Palo Alto lands located are to be utilized. With that, we turn to housing. The department is recommending that the full housing demand be provided for as documented in the Nexus study that was completed last year. What this means is that 100% of both market rate and affordable housing needs generated by the 20% increase in the size of the campus would need to be provided. All of the market rate housing needed would need to be built as net new units, with the provision that 70% are required to be on campus and only 30% are allowed to be located off campus. This is consistent with the existing housing linkage policy that requires all of the housing to be on campus, with special approval required for any off-campus housing. This also tracks with the 1985 land use policy agreement that indicates the tax-exempt academic and supportive uses, including housing, should be located on unincorporated lands. Market rate units would be subject to the inclusionary housing ordinance that requires 16% of all new housing projects within the community plan area to be affordable. All of the affordable units may be constructed, or an in lieu fee payment may be made pursuant to the Affordable Housing Mitigation Impact Fee Ordinance. This provides flexibility for the use of campus lands while still meeting the demand for affordable housing. Based on the total housing demand of 2,172 units, you'll see that number throughout the presentation. It is broken down as 1,131 affordable units and 1,041 market rate units based on the actual income levels of the anticipated net new workforce needed to serve the new development as documented in the Nexus study. This is the basis of the departmental recommendation. In terms of the existing housing situation for Stanford provided workforce housing, we have just over 40% located on campus and just under 60% located off campus, but in nearby locations in Palo Alto, Menlo Park, and Los Altos. This is an important point because both the 1985 Land Use Policy Agreement and the Stanford Community Plan stipulate that academic uses, including housing, be located on the unincorporated campus, and only non-academic uses be subject to city annexation. This existing housing includes projects currently under development and those that have received planning approvals, including the recent Cabrillo Dolores subdivision and the Middle Plaza project in Menlo Park. As a result, the department is recommending that fully 70% of all new housing be required on campus and only 30% maximum be allowed to be off campus. And there you see the total number again, the 2,172 units broken down into the 30% and 70% portions. such that over time, as the housing is built out to support the full development proposed, the majority of the provided housing would be located on campus, which would go up to 55%, more in alignment with the policy goals of having the university-related uses contained within the campus itself. Based on sites designated for housing within the existing Stanford Community Plan and the countywide housing element, frequently referred to as housing opportunity sites within the documents, all of the required housing could be accommodated in these blue areas shown. This would not result in the transformation of the entire campus into an urban apartment complex as asserted by the applicant. These would be mid-rise buildings at densities of approximately 30 to 40 units per acre within these existing housing opportunity sites, which represent vacant or underutilized sites on the campus. This clearly shows that all units could fit on the campus. Even with the existing and required new housing provided for, only 23% of the total Stanford housing demand is accounted for as part of this new GUP. With nearly 20,000 Stanford-related households needing housing throughout the Bay Area, there would be strong demand for well-located, affordable housing, despite understandable concerns about having your employer and landlord be the same, as discussed at the last meeting on May 30th in Palo Alto from the Commission. The past history of existing Stanford providing housing shows that this has not been a substantial problem. We take a quick break here to see if there's any questions on what we've covered so far before we turn to comparing the planning department's recommendations compared to Stanford's recent offer proposal dated June 11th. Thank you.
Commissioner Moore?
A question on the numbers. So the fact that for the affordable unit requirement that up to 560 units could be accommodated with in lieu fees, would that then equate to, actually be a little more than 373, but it would potentially, it could reduce the number of affordable units on the Stanford campus if that were taking place, and then would that mean that a proportionally higher percentage of market rate units would be on campus in order to meet that 70%?
Yes, the way the conditions are written currently, it's 70% of units constructed. So if you subtracted out a certain amount of in lieu impact fee units, that the fee would be paid rather than the unit constructed, that total number of units built would be reduced, so the 70% number would be smaller and the 30% number would be smaller as well.
Other questions? Commissioner Rouser?
Yeah, can you bring the last slide up? You made a comment right at the end and somehow that just kind of faded and I didn't understand what the point was. But my question, I guess, partly related, I think, with what you're discussing, is this almost like what we're saying that Stanford would be if 100% of faculty and staff, that's not ancillary workers also included in this? So our goal isn't to have like a company town where everybody works within the borders, right? So
Correct.
So that's not what we're trying to get to here.
Correct. This slide shows that when we talk about the amount of housing required for the new GUP, we're strictly focused on the net new increase as documented in the Nexus study. We're not talking about trying to house the entire universe of Stanford-related faculty, staff, other workers, which is represented by the entire pie chart, which is nearly 20,000 households. We're just talking about less than a quarter of that, and that orange wedge is 23%, and that represents the existing housing provided by Stanford on campus and within those nearby areas off campus, as well as the staff recommended net new housing added to that, the 2172 number.
So that the 6 mile radius, all that's included in the 23%?
Yes.
Gotcha, thank you.
Are there other questions? Commissioner Gill?
Thanks, Ms. Bradley. Are there any 30 to 40 acre units in construction or on Stanford's campus right now?
Most of the development on campus is within the San Juan district. It's actually quite a bit lower density, less than 8 units per acre. There's some what we call R3 or medium density developments on campus that take the form of condominiums or townhomes, and those are at about the 15 unit per acre density. And then when you get into the graduate student housing, those densities become much greater. And the 30 to 40 dwelling units per acre is closer to what has been proposed by Stanford in the Quarry District as part of their original application for 550 units on 14 acres, works out to about 40 units per acre.
Thank you.
But it's more similar to what we see in the surrounding cities.
As far as density?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Would you be so kind as to define workforce housing? What is that demographic?
Our preferred terminology is faculty, staff, and other workers. In order to fit some words on the slides, we've started using workforce a little bit and to be a little more user-friendly. But generally, workforce housing is for people who are in the workforce. So it can range from low income up to moderate income and above. But generally, when from a policy standpoint, you talk about providing affordable housing for the workforce, it's usually from about low income to moderate income and maybe a little bit above, but not much more.
And how does that match up with wages and things of that nature in terms of availability and affordability for people that are, I'm assuming we're talking about just the universe of Stanford University. We're not talking about construction workers or short-term or temporary type of applications for housing, are we? That's more...
The definition of worker in the Nexus study was fairly comprehensive in that it did capture contingent workers, but there had to be you had to be more than part-time to be counted as a worker, as we discussed at the last meeting. But the fact that the median income in Santa Clara County is so high, one of the highest in the nation, the result is that you could have a low-income person by definition who's still making a good amount of money, because the median area income for this area is over $120,000 a year for a 4-person family, and all of the affordable housing programs are based on that number and take a percentage of it as you go down the income ladder down to the lowest category of 30%, 0 to 30% of that average median income. So it's a fairly wide spectrum of incomes, and what the Nexus study showed is that a significant proportion of the workforce as part of the new development would fit into a variety of those affordable income categories.
And so one of the conditions for entrance into some of this workforce housing that we're talking about would be employment on Stanford universities?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Are there, Commissioner Levy?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question about a comment you made a minute ago that we'd like to see all academic uses within unincorporated property. I guess that means that housing is considered an academic use, the faculty housing?
Technically, we have academic uses, and then we have academic support uses. And the academic support uses are essentially all the uses necessary to support the main academic use. And so housing that is devoted exclusively for Stanford employed individuals or folks that meet the definition of a worker for the campus are part of that supportive use.
All right, and that supportive use is supposed to be entirely on unincorporated properties?
The land use policy agreement sort of sets that out as the baseline condition. It doesn't present it as a hard requirement, but the underlying assumption of the land use agreement basically says all of the academic and academic support uses are and should continue to be on the campus, and the non-academic uses, the property tax and sales tax generating uses should be can be on Stanford lands, but then they are subject to annexation by the surrounding cities. And that's the essence of the three-party agreement.
Okay, good, thank you. On slide number 10, where you have the potential housing sites, these are really just your thoughts on where we could potentially house these, or based on?
No, these are adopted. These are from adopted policy documents by the county. Two documents. The Stanford Community Plan has a chapter on housing, and within that chapter, there are sites earmarked for housing.
Okay, good.
And the second document is the county's housing element, which goes through a similar exercise of identifying opportunity sites countywide, but also has a special section just for Stanford lands. And these sites show up on those two documents. And I would like to point out that Stanford is proposing, and the department is recommending approval of elimination of the map within the community plan that shows these opportunity sites. And the simple reason from a planning perspective is that the housing element must be consistent with the community plan and vice versa, but the housing element is updated on a much more frequent cycle that's regulated and required by the state. And so currently the two documents are a little bit out of alignment, and by just having one map that's updated every 7 years approximately, it'll be more clarity of what those sites really are meant to be.
Okay, another question concerning this, and in follow-up to Commissioner Moore's question about the in lieu fees. If we have 60% potentially of the housing, oh, you can leave that one slide up, that'd be great. If you have 60% of the low-income housing potentially going off-site, paid for through the in lieu fees, and I look at the densities of these, which is the 30, 40 units per acre, which is fairly high density, how does this densities align with the demand for the housing based on staffing?
Well, one way to look at it, if you go to the next slide with the labels. So for example, the driving range site, that's 17 acres at 33 units per acre equals 560 units. That's almost exactly the number of units, just coincidentally, almost exactly the number of units that could be provided through the in lieu fee that we're discussing. So one way to visualize it would be if that option were pursued to its maximum and all those units were provided through that mechanism, you could take that site off the list, and with the remaining 4 blue rectangles, you would be able to accommodate the total net new needed.
Right. Well, thank you.
Any other questions right now? Okay, I see none, so would you please continue with your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, the next part of the presentation is still focused on housing, but we're shifting to address the letter addressed to the Planning Commission received from Stanford University dated June 11th. So hopefully you've all had a chance to review that, and we wanted to acknowledge receipt of it and get into the exercise of providing some analysis, which we've just started. So we're going to focus on the letter covers a lot of territory, but we are focused on the housing and transportation elements of it. So the good news is Stanford is proposing to provide 100% of the documented need found in the Nexus study of the 2,172 units, which is great. However, the county staff finds that credit for units at Escondido Village is not appropriate, given that this is graduate student housing that is being built to address existing demand for additional grad students related to the growth under the existing 2000 general use permit that has already occurred. Middle Plaza is a project on Stanford lands within the city of Menlo Park that was approved by the city in 2017. And the planning for that goes back to 2007. So that project has been in the works for a long time and is currently in the major grading and utility work phase of construction and is expected for completion and occupancy in 2020. Again, this project was planned and intended to serve the existing housing demand from the existing 2000 general use permit. This project, along with smaller projects such as the net new 5 units at the Cabrillo Dolores subdivision, is accounted for as existing housing to serve the existing housing needs. So this results, what we feel, for an apples-to-apples comparison of just over 1,300 units, with the 1,307 to the department recommendation, which is also the Nexus study determination of 2,172 units. And the Stanford proposal, as currently envisioned, is 40% less than the documented demand. We feel that's the bottom line comparison.
I wanted to take a moment to expand upon the point. If the Planning Commission recommends to the board the staff recommendation of the 2172 units, we won't solve the current affordability crisis. What we will do is avoid exacerbating the current crisis because we'll provide enough housing to meet the new household demand for housing emanating from this development proposal. So the point is that this administration does not give credit for the housing that was identified, the half credit for the Escondido Village project and the second project, Middle Plaza project, thank you. Because it really is addressing demand for housing that arises from the 2000 general use permit. It's housing that's needed now for development that's occurred in the past. So that's why we're not giving credit for those particular units. And so that's why our conclusion is, in fact, that Stanford is proposing 40% less housing than we are recommending to you. And as I sit here before you today, if that is approved, we will exacerbate the affordability crisis and further increase that imbalance between jobs created and housing needed in order to house those workers.
Thank you. Moving on to the affordable housing. In terms of affordable units, Stanford's proposing 692 units compared to the department recommendation for 1,131. This represents a 39% less than the documented demand as documented in the Nexus study. Bringing it all together here, the Stanford housing proposal is significantly less than the full housing need at both the affordable and market rate levels as shown here. For context, we wanted to take a moment and show the progress the county has been making on the housing front overall. The Measure A bond for nearly $1 billion was approved with over a 2/3 vote back in 2016, and is now in its second year of implementation, and has resulted in over $234 million spent for affordable homes for low-income individuals and families in 6 cities. This has resulted in over 1,400 new units and over 480 renovated units. And additionally, as of December of last year, $25 million has been provided for first-time homebuyer programs. Additionally, the county is planning for transitional and permanent housing on the county government center site as part of the Civic Center master plan process. While the focus of these hearings obviously is on Stanford, this information is presented to make clear that housing is an issue of the highest importance at the county, and solutions will be sought across the board in a variety of ways to address this housing crisis.
I wanted to take a moment to sort of underscore this point. There were public comments made the county should be doing more for housing. There's no jurisdiction in this region that's doing more for housing, and this is just an illustration of what we've done in 2 years, and we have many more years to contribute to sort of solving this crisis. And then I wanted to emphasize another point that Mr. Bradley made, which is that internally in the administration, we are having discussions and plan to present to the board in the early fall our own civic center plan here where we are today. And in that plan, not only is it permanent supportive housing and transitional, but we are Also examining workforce housing, housing for county employees as well, because we recognize that we too need to contribute to help solve that imbalance between jobs and housing.
Thank you. We now turn to transportation, the transportation issue and the policy response to this key issue. Obviously, the new development proposed is significant and would increase the campus by 20%, but the goal of the recommended condition of approval is to hold the traffic fairly constant to current conditions. It would not necessarily improve current conditions, but from a planning perspective, this is still a fairly high bar to try to limit a development of this nature to this level of traffic control. But fortunately, the county has tools in the toolbox, so to speak, on how to do this. The basis for this policy decision is the required finding in the county ordinance code for approval of use permits, including this general use permit, that the use will not substantially worsen traffic congestion affecting the surrounding area. This is one finding out of 11 use permit findings the Planning Commission will be asked to make a recommendation on at its next meeting. For this reason, and in response to community concerns about traffic levels and existing traffic problems with congestion in the surrounding area, the Planning Department has devised a 3-tier traffic control system that builds on the success of the no net new commute trip standard from the 2000 general use permit. Tier 1 is similar to the existing no net new commute trip standards. However, a peak period is added, a 3-hour peak period is added to ensure that peak spreading does not occur. Tier 2 applies the concepts from Tier 1, but in the reverse direction, in other words, the non-peak direction. Tier 3 is simply the all-day, everyday traffic to provide a high-level view of the total traffic generated by the campus and seek to limit the growth of that. We've struggled with how to clearly explain these concepts, so we're going to experiment with some visuals here for you. To illustrate these terms, we have these graphics to show the peak hour and the peak 3-hour period traffic going into the campus in the morning. So that's peak hour, which is 1 hour, obviously, and peak period, which is 3 hours, going into the morning, is going into the campus in the morning in the peak direction, is one component of Tier 1. The second component of Tier 2 is in the afternoon or the early evening, where you have a peak hour and a peak period going out. So that's the essence of the Tier 1 concept. And then Tier 2 is the no net new reverse commute trips, which is monitored and controlled. This is when people are leaving the campus in the morning and coming into the campus in the afternoon, hence the reverse commute. The average daily trips has been counted in the past, but not measured against a metric or a standard. This new general use permit would require an all-day traffic limit to be established and a requirement to not go over that level. This is all traffic in both directions with no trip credits or deductions for cut-through traffic. To give you a sense of the numbers, the average daily trips from 2004 to 2016, so it's a 12-year data set, was approximately 77,400 cars within an all-day, 24-hour period. If annual traffic counts for Tier 1 during the AM and PM peak hours exceed the baseline volume by 1% or more in any single year after applying trip credits, Stanford would be required to make fair share payments to mitigate its impacts to off-campus roadways and intersections. If annual traffic counts for Tier 2 during the AM and peak hours exceed the baseline volume by 2% or more in any single year after applying trip credits, Stanford would be required to make fair share payments, the same as Tier 1. For Tier 3, if annual traffic counts indicated that all-day traffic counts exceeded the baseline volume by 3% or more in any single year, Stanford would be required to halt development. For all 3 tiers, following a noticed public hearing, suspension of development or withholding authorization of the next development phase until Stanford has demonstrated compliance with the standards for 1 year. Stanford's proposal dated June 11th would eliminate the 3-hour peak period in Tier 1 and eliminate Tiers 2 and 3 completely, which would track essentially with what the standard has been under the 2000 general use permit to the current day. This brings us to our third and final key issue of open space. Not in the conditions of approval, but within the proposed updates to the community plan itself, you'll see staff recommendations to extend the 4/5 vote requirement for any changes to the AGB from 25 to 99 years. Continue to restrict development in the foothills through the general use permit, and continue to limit development in the foothills pursuant to the community plan and the open space and field research zoning district. With these three robust measures, the department finds that the long-term protection of the open space areas of the community plan, i.e. the foothills, would continue to be protected with a high degree of certainty. That concludes the staff presentation. Staff and the consultants are available to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and answering a lot of questions, and for addressing Stanford's 131-page letter that we've just got less than 2 days ago. So I really appreciate all the efforts you've made to try to make this clear, and it's a very complex thing, as we know. Okay, I'm sure that there are going to be some more questions from the commission on this. Commissioner Moore, looks like you're ready to go.
Okay, yeah, I guess it's a two-part question on transportation. So there was concern expressed about the increased housing requirement on campus and the potential inability for Stanford to meet the reverse commute and daily trip standards. Could you explain a little bit about what options Stanford would have to meet those in relating to the baseline figures and when those would be set, and how feasible is it, given the recommendations for Stanford, to potentially meet those upward caps for reverse commute and daily trip standards? So that's question one, and then I'll follow up with one more.
Thank you. So there's really three different options available, or three different mechanisms, I believe, that address that concern. The first is that when you get into the details on setting the baseline, which is important because the baseline becomes the basis, obviously, for future measurements. So for the Tier 2, which is the reverse trips we're talking about, the baseline would actually not be set during the first, second, or third year of the development under the new GUP. It would occur in the 4th and 5th year, and it would be an average of the 4th and 5th year actual trips coming out of the campus in the reverse direction, or into the campus in the reverse direction, as the case may be. So it provides a little bit of a time buffer for all of the existing development under the 2000 GUP to be completed by then, for all of the graduate student housing units to be occupied under the Escondido Village project, which is anticipated to be done next year and fully up and running. So the goal is not to penalize any existing development that was done under the existing rules, but to clearly provide a time frame where a baseline could be set to sort of capture this net new development we're talking about and apply a standard to it. So that's the first thing, the time factor of the baseline setting. The second thing is, instead of a 1% trigger for the trips like we have in the Tier 1, it's been doubled to 2% based on the advice of our traffic engineering experts at AECOM, because the nature of traffic in the reverse direction by its very nature is there's less of it. So we can add a little bit more traffic to it without getting to that substantially worsened threshold. So there's the trigger amount is the second variable, which has been doubled from 1% to 2%. And then the third thing is just as when the county approved the very large project for Escondido Village, 2,400 units, net new, closer to 2,000 units, the concept around traffic was simply that the folks who would live there would be provided more services, such as daycare and fitness facilities and yoga and small markets and cafes where you didn't have to constantly get in your car to drive into downtown Palo Alto to seek those services. They would be provided close by in a convenient manner, which is consistent with the concepts in the community plan for call for that type of compact, walkable development with services close by. So it's really those three mechanisms we find to be the primary ways to address that issue.
Quick question, are trip credits also a part of that?
Yes.
Okay, and then the last question, second one is, could you just provide a little more explanation in the staff response from our previous meeting, where it says that the staff found that a per-trip fee would not adequately provide an effective enforcement mechanism for the traffic control measures, nor would it be effective to prevent the substantial worsening of traffic congestion in the surrounding communities as a result of the proposed development. And that says that to prevent worsening of traffic, trip caps with consequences would do that. So could you explain a little bit more, though, the rationale and how you came to this conclusion, as of course it differs from what is in the EIR mitigation?
Sure, yes. So both the community plan and the EIR contain the concepts of no net new commute trips combined with the enforcement mechanism that if it is violated, the university shall pay a fair share impact fee on impacted intersections. So how that shakes out in practice is you have an intersection that is impacted, but the fair share percentage of trips going through that intersection may be a single-digit percentage of all the trips. So let's call it 9%. So then the city of Palo Alto or Menlo Park says, hey, we have this impacted intersection. You violated your trip standard. We want to fix the intersection, and so we calculate the 9% cost of the intersection improvement, and it's a fair share, but it's not enough to actually fix the intersection. And so then that money can then be used for something else, like a bicycle improvement or some other circulation system improvement, but it doesn't get to the actual practice of really providing a very strong incentive to live within the caps. And then the per trip fee exacerbates that situation even more, where instead of paying 9% of, say, $500,000, you're paying you're breaking that up further into a per trip cost, which is then even smaller.
Other questions for staff? Commissioner Gill?
Hey, thanks, Bradley. On the consequences application for the transportation issues, there's a wide range of what people are projecting to be fair share costs. I've seen $1 million to $4.62 million in terms of traffic mitigation fees. Where does the county stand on that, and how does it feel that it would trigger some sort of what it could be concerned and defined as fair share?
So the effort around that has been focused on the fair share percentage rather than trying to predict the cost of future improvements that may be needed. Because it's a multi-year plan or permit that goes out over 10, 15, 20 years, any number we came up with today would be quickly out of date in the future. So we've sort of not tried to put a dollar amount on the total mitigation cost of those impacted intersections and the fair share percentage, but we have nailed down the fair share percentage very clearly, so that if an intersection in the future did have a project associated with it and there was an identified capital improvement budget, you could go to the EIR and the conditions of approval and find that percentage required for that intersection from this project.
Okay. In terms of just the surrounding communities and looking to Stanford to go ahead and reach out to the communities with other services ancillary, how does that work into the transportation program?
In terms of coordination with surrounding cities such as Palo Alto and Bellevue.
Yeah, would that be a negative would that be a negative on Stanford if the communities around it are asking Stanford to go ahead and offer more services such as plays and theater and music and all those types of things? Would they be punished for having the community take part in those services?
Oh, in terms of the traffic program?
Yeah.
Yeah, it is possible that the trips from community-oriented events would be reflected in the traffic counts, and that could become a factor that would need to be managed appropriately.
So that could be a disincentive.
Could be.
Thank you.
Mr. Levy, do you have a question?
Yes, I'm still trying to get a handle on the concept of the nexus for the growth. And I started this line of conversation in our last meeting about the percentage of traffic that is actually attributable to Stanford reverse trips and all-day trips. If you have 2.5 people per house and only one of those people is employed by Stanford, I'm trying to understand the nexus of their responsibility for reducing all those trips. Now, when a developer develops a piece of property, a house on their property, or development, they're responsible for the nexus traffic and et cetera. But this is a little bit of a unique circumstance in that Stanford may potentially be providing housing to others above and beyond what they need specifically for their staff. And so I'm just curious, how that plays out. Is the housing that's being provided housing that's strictly for Stanford staff, or is it for all the housing required plus their significant others? And so it's really hard for me to understand the nexus concept from both a traffic and a housing perspective until I understand the basic of whether the housing that's being provided is pretty much strictly for staff, or does it go above and beyond that?
We're going to introduce David Dosimov. He was at your last meeting on May 30th, and he's the lead author of the Nexus study, and it looks like he's prepared to take a swing at that one.
Well, I could take part of that question at least. So, and I'll focus on the 2,172 units and who are those for. That's the net demand for housing. So that considers, so if you were to look at the total number of units that you needed to house Stanford's workforce, it would be quite a bit more units than that. But we credit the fact that each unit, is not, it's housing both a Stanford staff person and perhaps another worker, right? So you'd maybe need something like 4,000 some units if you were to provide one unit per Stanford worker. So 2172 is the net after you cut it back for the multiple worker households.
All right, so if I understand what you're saying correctly, if you were to provide one unit for every Stanford employee, the new employee, it would be 2.5 times the what's being asked for.
1.77 times, because you only look at the workers, right? Not children.
But the children are still going to result in the reverse commutes and the all-time traffic counts.
Right, but when we calculate the net demand for housing, we start with the number of workers and how many units do we need to house workers. And so since there's an average of 1.77 workers in a household, that's the basis for translating from number of workers to number of housing units needed.
Okay, good, thank you for that. I'll let somebody else ask the next question.
I'm sorry? Okay. Okay. Commissioner Moore?
Okay. So on the open space topic, the 4/5 vote is to change the academic growth boundary is recommended for 99 years. So if a future Board of Supervisors decided not to change the academic growth boundary, but just to vote to change the policy that states it's a 4/5 vote for 99 years, would that vote require 3 votes or 4 votes of the board to just change that proposed policy?
That's what I asked last time.
Elizabeth Pianka, Lead Deputy County Counsel. If the action of the board was to amend the 4/5 vote requirement, it's a legislative action of the board that would require 3 votes of the board to modify the 4/5 requirement.
Okay, that clarifies things a lot. So given that, I will bring this up. This is my third time, and I'm hoping I'm getting it clear this time about, and I apologize, but I think it's important, that the Stanford Community Plan, again, has implementation recommendations specifically linking increased development within the academic growth boundary, meaning within the campus, and I've cited the policy numerous times, which I can look up, but it links, it says if this occurs and increased density occurs within the urban growth boundary, academic growth boundary within the campus itself, the academic campus, that the county should be looking for opportunities to expand permanent or conservation easements within the foothills. And when I brought this up before, somehow I was confused. People were confused that I was referring to non-existent density allowances that exist in the foothills outside the academic growth boundary, but that is not at all what I was referring to. I was referring to this policy, which is, in a sense, provides that nexus statement about academic new development in exchange for more permanent conservation in the foothills. That's very, very clear in that policy statement. So right now, currently, only about 6% of the foothills area is protected with a permanent conservation easement, and there's 14% of the area that has a 50-year easement on it, and then the rest of the 80% would be protected based on this 99-year 4/5 policy, which now we know could be amended with a 3/5 vote, which is not nearly as strong. So the question is that, given that, is not there a compelling argument to consider actually implementing this 19-year-old implementation recommendation, because this is exactly the time right now that we are considering a large expansion of the academic campus density. This is exactly the situation in which this recommendation calls for looking at conservation easements. So any response to that?
If I may, Commissioner Moore, can you remind us of that policy that you're looking at in the community plan?
Sure, just give me a second. I have it on various documents here. But it's the Stanford Community Plan, and it's under the open space, on the open space chapter. And, oh my gosh. Okay, if it's okay, here it is. Okay. Stanford Community Plan, policy OS, parentheses I3. And I'll just read it. It's just a sentence. Identify and pursue opportunities to remove existing obstacles to development within the academic growth boundary in exchange for easement protection of lands outside the academic growth boundary. That's the main policy. Or, I'm sorry, it's a implementation recommendation.
Oh, okay. Commissioner Moore, are we talking about OSI 2, you said? 3.
3.
Identify and pursue opportunities to remove existing obstacles to development within the academic growth boundary in exchange for easement protection of lands outside AGB. Okay, so this is not actually a policy or a what's called a. There's essentially strategies, which I think of as goals, but they're labeled strategies. There's high-level strategies. There's policies to try to achieve those strategies. And then there's implementation recommendations, which are detailed implementation measures recommended to achieve the policies, which implement the strategies. So this is a very specific implementation recommendation that has been used already in a more limited fashion than what I think you're recommending. You're thinking of more of an overall easement over the entire foothills?
No, in a previous meeting, there was, in the original Stanford Sustainability Plan, there was a specific study that was done that let's see, they had categories of high sensitivity, moderate sensitivity, and low sensitivity. And what I had suggested way back was that we consider at least the easement to go across at least the high sensitivity lands, which represents 26% or 575 acres. And they use specific criteria to determine this. So this was a pretty comprehensive study that was done back when the original Sustainable Development Plan came forward. So in other words, there's rationale. I wasn't proposing the entire area, but just areas where you could make a strong case for the importance of more permanent conservation of the lands.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from, and from a planning perspective, this policy is focused on solving specific issues with development within the AGB, and quite frankly, there are no existing obstacles to development within the AGB that haven't already been addressed by this policy, and or this implementation recommendation. I'll give you what I'm thinking of is in the past, there was an area within the AGB, but there was very serious species and habitat issues for the California tiger salamander, and that affected the Lathrop district the most significantly, which on the map is sort of the lowest down development district that's within the AGB, but visually it kind of looks like it's in the open space area. So there was significant obstacles to developing anything in that area because of these high level environmental concerns and sensitive habitat. And so the county and Stanford worked with California Fish and Wildlife and the federal Fish and Wildlife agencies to create a habitat conservation plan. And essentially, all of that work essentially falls under this specific implementation recommendation. And there isn't any other areas that we're aware of that have existing obstacles to development within the AGB that this similar mechanism could be used. And I would suggest that type of effort in terms of a more overreaching use of this type of strategy would probably need some new policy direction from the commission and the board to move in that direction. But based on our existing basis, we don't find we have the grounds to ask for that at this time.
Okay, interesting. So I guess just parting comment would be that, I wonder if because there seems to be this never-ending proposed new development over lots of years, the next 17 years, and then the next installment after that, that if there was more precise zoning beyond the A1, but that's more precise with actual density maximums, maybe there would be more of a numerical basis for which to further justify easement protection, because again, it's all one landowner we're talking about, and it just seems strange to just constantly be increasing the development potential without there being any further conservation, that's more permanent in nature. than what is being proposed now. So I'll just leave it at that.
Are there other questions right now? Commissioner Rouser?
Yeah, I just want to touch on a couple of items just in the public response, either in letters in the last meeting. Things like from some of the groups, the bird-friendly glass standards, lighting at night, those kinds of things. Is the county kind of moving to develop those kinds of standards? And is this something that we as a commission, they're broader things to look at rather than necessarily focusing on that for this particular GUP? Is this something that as the county, as we apply new standards, as they develop, they're going to have to follow those standards? They're not locked into any building codes as of the date this thing gets approved. So is that kind of consistent with?
To answer your question in brief, the county administration is in fact at this moment preparing a bird-safe design ordinance for all of the unincorporated areas, and we hope to bring that to the Board of Supervisors in the fall.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
And any other questions right now? Commissioner Resendez? No. Okay, no, okay. I've got a question, a couple questions. I don't know if you could answer this now, but in the letter from Stanford, where they have made suggested changes to the staff's suggested conditions of approval, in many cases they say, well, we should go back to what the final EIR recommended. And I'm sure you haven't had a chance to look at all these things, but is there a general statement that you would make at this time or not about going beyond what's recommended in the final EIR?
Thank you for that question. Yes, we have had a chance to do a quick review, and I can't give detailed response to all the items, but in general, we find that the county code allows for four different areas that need to be considered when we're thinking about what's appropriate as a condition of approval, and we feel that the conditions as recommended by the department are consistent with those standards. And in some cases, the conditions will track very closely with the environmental impact report and its associated mitigation measures. In other cases, there'll be justifiable reasons to go above and beyond that.
Thank you. And then just a small clarification question. We've been talking about average daily trips. I think you said that over the last few years, the average daily trip number for Stanford was 77,400. And so that would be over 24 hours, coming in, going out, and not subtracting any of any cut-through traffic.
Correct, but also similar to Tier 2, within this Tier 3 average daily trips, we would also have a delayed baseline setting exercise to be done towards the very end of what we call Phase 1 development, which in other words would be the average of the 4th and the 5th year after the GUP is approved, to allow for all the existing development to kind of get established and become part of the normal operation of the campus.
And so the average daily trips could include a basketball game and something at Bing Concert Hall and students going to adult continuing ed classes at night,
All that stuff.
all that stuff. Okay. All right. Thank you. And any other questions right now? Okay. So now I will go to the public hearing, and Stanford will be the first speaker, and I have about 20 cards, so that means that people will get 2 minutes each, but Stanford gets 10 minutes to start with. So, and thank you for your letter and detailed analysis of what staff is proposing.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair and members of the Planning Commission. My name is Catherine Palter, and I represent Stanford University. We have been reviewing the proposed conditions of approval since we received them about 3 weeks ago. On Tuesday, we submitted our comments on these proposed conditions. We'd like to take this opportunity to walk you through 2 important areas of alignment, along with some concerns. I'm pleased to announce a significant update that aligns us with the county administration, one that we hope will move us forward in a spirit of cooperation. We have in the past expressed our concern about the amount of housing that the administration has asked us to build, especially housing that the market could deliver if facilitated by zoning regulations. Related to that are our concerns about the need to preserve our core academic campus to fulfill our missions of teaching and research, and about being singled out among all employers, even though we are arguably the most progressive provider of housing in the county. At the same time, Stanford recognizes the urgent need to increase workforce housing throughout the region. Taking care of our workforce is an important priority, and we embrace the opportunity to build more housing so that we can be part of the solution. While no one entity can solve the housing situation on its own, we appreciate the opportunity to demonstrate leadership in this area. Stanford's response is to deliver enough new housing to fully satisfy the housing demand generated by our proposed new academic development. The university can meet the housing need for the new faculty, staff, postdocs, contractors, and other worker populations through a variety of means, delivering 1,307 workforce units during the life of the permit, delivering 1,300 new apartments at Escondido Village graduate residences in September 2020, which will free up hundreds of workforce housing units in the community when over 2,000 graduate students vacate those units and move on to campus. Stanford is seeking credit for half of this number, or the equivalent of 650 market rate units. These units were not required of Stanford, and the fact that Stanford began the construction early in anticipation of future needs should be acknowledged. Delivering 215 new apartments at Stanford's Middle Plaza project in Menlo Park. Stanford has received entitlements to build this housing and can open it shortly after the new general use permit is approved. In total, these steps would fully offset the demand for 2,172 workforce housing units that the county calculated in its Nexus study. Again, Stanford is prepared and eager to do this, and we want to work with you to achieve it. To deliver this housing, our analysis shows that some important adjustments to the administration's proposed conditions will be needed. Stanford believes these can be accomplished in a manner that protects the community, delivers mutual benefits, and remains true to the Board of Supervisors' prior policy directions. First, Stanford seeks flexibility to deliver up to 70% of the market rate units off campus. The conditions currently allow only 30% of market rate units to be constructed off campus. To serve the needs of our workforce, we think it's critically important to have that flexibility to build the market rate units in the communities where our employees want to live. Second, Stanford is willing to accept a condition that requires 70% of the below market rate units it constructs to be located on the core central campus. We can do this if the below market requirements in the conditions are changed to match the ordinance that the Board of Supervisors adopted last September. The board set its affordable housing fee at a level that the administration stated would be sufficient to deliver the 575 below market rate units that are needed to satisfy 100% of the demand for the extremely low, the very low, and low income housing resulting from the new general use permit. Stanford is willing to deliver all 575 below market rate units that the board decided to require as mitigation. Third, Stanford seeks future flexibility to relocate deed restrictions from units on campus to units off campus within a 6-mile radius if the need arises. This is essential to ensuring Stanford can meet the needs of its workforce, as these will invariably change over time. Fourth, Stanford seeks reasonable changes to the conditions that address transportation impacts. Stanford asks that the transportation conditions match the transportation mitigation measures in the county's December 2018 final environmental impact report. The EIR's mitigation measures reflect a feasible and sustainable approach to minimizing traffic congestion while encouraging housing construction. The EIR's mitigation measures were developed by independent transportation experts based on a technical analysis that the county staff has acknowledged is thorough and complete. By contrast, Stanford believes the transportation conditions proposed by the administration will prevent the university from providing new workforce housing on its campus. As we explained at the last hearing, the requirement for no increase in reverse commute direction trips will prevent Stanford from building more workforce housing on its academic campus because the standard is not achievable. For similar reasons, Stanford also is not able to accept a condition that requires a cap on all-day trips. The EIR did not require an all-day trip cap because it found there are no significant congestion-based impacts during the times of the day when traffic is relatively light. This cap would prevent housing and have the unintended consequence of limiting the many programs that Stanford offers to the surrounding community. Such an outcome does not serve the interests of the community or Stanford. Lastly, Stanford seeks reasonable limitations on the conditions that call for future regulatory and cost burdens resulting from on-campus housing, including conditions calling for undefined studies of parkland, municipal health and social services, and childcare. Stanford cannot commit to more workforce housing on campus without knowing how much that housing will cost. With these modifications, we will be able to deliver enough housing to fully satisfy the demand created by Stanford's proposed academic facilities. And under the certainty provided by a development agreement, we will be able to provide that housing now, rather than on a phased basis over the next 20 years. With regard to phasing, I'm pleased to share that we can agree with another area of alignment with the county administration and are prepared to accept a condition that requires phased academic development. We understand and appreciate that the county administration intends that its phasing requirements serve as checkpoints to determine whether Stanford is complying with all the conditions. Stanford supports the concept of compliance check-ins and has suggested slight wording changes to clarify this intent and avoid ambiguity. Most of Stanford's other edits to the conditions of approval are suggested in order to ensure the conditions match the mitigation measures in the county EIR or to ensure the conditions are accurate and feasible. We cannot go over each change in this 10-minute presentation, but hope you will direct staff to work with us to develop an amended set of conditions before you finally consider them. We have provided you with significant changes to the proposed conditions of approval, and our comments on the 280-page community plan have not yet been submitted. We ask that the Planning Commission take the time that you need to provide a thoughtful recommendation to the Board of Supervisors on each of our proposed revisions. We believe that together we can develop a fair and feasible set of conditions, but we are concerned about our ability to accomplish this in only a month. We suggest that we work through the summer to prepare for decision hearings in the fall. At that time, we are hopeful that we also can bring you a development agreement that describes the community benefits that Stanford would like to provide and that all stakeholders have agreed upon. We look forward to approval of the general use permit so that Stanford can commence building more workforce housing as soon as possible. Thank you, and we're available to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Are there questions for Catherine Palter? Commissioner Moore?
Yeah, a couple questions. So the request to be able to have more flexibility on the deed restriction for affordable housing on the campus to allow relocation off the campus. So I was just trying to get my head around the numbers because, okay, so right now there's the ability to pay in lieu fees for a portion of the affordable housing, and then that by its nature would be off campus. Then in addition to this, if there was still more flexibility in relocating the deed restriction, so then you would in a sense be moving more affordable housing off the campus and off campus as a result of that? Is that what a potential result could be?
I think what we're saying is initially we would build 70% of the units that we build would be on campus, the below market rate units. They would have that deed restriction on them. In the future, as we see the needs of our workforce changes, Once we've built that supply on campus, we could move the deed restriction within 6 miles on other land that Stanford has.
Okay. Let's see, the other comments about the reverse commute and all-day trips. So you had mentioned that that the county was saying no net increase, and yet my understanding is at a future baseline date that they would be permitting a 2% increase for reverse commute and a 3% increase for all day. Do you see that that would be insufficient allowance for accommodating the new housing?
One thing I do want to clarify about, it was a comparison to what we have today. What we have today is 1% confidence interval, which recognizes statistically with variability in data, if you're within 1%, it's the same number. And we were afforded a confidence interval and a threshold. So right now, it's essentially the same thing, talking about 2%. Frankly, there's been no analysis to determine what this 2% threshold is. There's just been a decision, it appears, that this is something that Stanford can do. What we're talking about with reverse commute trips, I mean, imagine you're in your own house and what your family does in terms of running trips throughout the day. I mean, you run for a variety. You're taking kids to school, you're running errands. These are the trips that happen that are home-based. And there just aren't transportation demand management programs that can help that. Stanford does a tremendous job at getting our commuters out of our cars. But these trips are a very different nature. We've looked at this really hard. We looked at it when we were looking at the EIR was being developed. And I think that is, with that understanding, that's why the EIR came up with a mitigation measure that said, the most feasible thing is for Stanford to assume that it can't make it and pay an upfront fee because this is just too difficult. So I can't stand here today and say it's feasible. There's absolutely no analysis, but at a gut level, these aren't the trips that can be removed by transportation demand management. And the concept of credits helping as well are also, it doesn't help either.
Okay. Commissioner Resendez?
Hello. Yes, again, in transportation fundings, the use will not substantially worsen traffic congestion in the surrounding areas. That's what you are saying. But I was looking at the consequences of the violation of the condition. Is either of the commute trip peak hours or peak periods standards are violated in any one year, the county shall immediately suspend the approval. Is not that too much?
That's
or you think you can accomplish that?
No, so we're suggesting we go back to the EIR mitigation measure, which said if we do not make no net new commute trips, we would pay our fair share of the intersection improvements. And there is no consequence such as stopping Stanford's academic development.
Well, that's what it says here, but.
Right, so we have the other view that we want to go back to the mitigation measure.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Commissioner Levy?
Up on that one quickly. If you end up going over the baseline over 1% in the commute direction, and it's decided that we need to have you pay your fair share allocation, don't we want to? Isn't that what the point of the phasing is about? That okay, maybe during that phase we can do that, but when it comes to moving it forward to the next phase, we need to put the stake in the ground and say this is where we need to determine the long-term feasibility of the development.
Our understanding is the phasing is meant to be a check-in on compliance with conditions.
Right, exactly. And if you're not able to comply with the conditions, isn't that sort of the whole point of the phasing, is to give people an opportunity to step back and say what's next?
I think that's the understanding, as long as we're agreeing to the conditions up front that we believe are feasible.
Okay, great. Because, from a project management perspective, I understand what you're saying about keeping the process running, but I think also the need for making sure that when we get to the end of the phase, we can step back and see where we are. I'd like to get your feedback on the Escondido Village and the other property, and, well, Escondido Village in particular, because staff was saying this doesn't count because it's student housing, and so we don't want to consider this as, a part of your future housing needs. And the other point they have is that this is for existing demand, and so we're talking about future demand now, and why are we giving credit for existing demand for future demand? So I'd like to see if you could, answer those two questions of staff. First of all, does it qualify because it's student housing? And second, are we really talking about future demand, or are we talking about existing demand that we're trying to accommodate?
I think it's important to kind of step back and just say what we're talking about is there's a new demand of 2,172 units, and Stanford's offering to supply that. Sometimes we're focused on what's happening in terms of time, what's happening in terms of location. But the fact is, with Escondido Village graduate residences, we were not required to build that under this GUP. It is true we are building it for the students that we have today, but the effect of that is, when that opens next year, those existing students are going to move onto campus, and that effectively frees up 1,300 more apartments somewhere in the region, likely low income, but they're going to move onto campus. That is effectively creating supply by the fact that we built those apartments. And what we're saying is we're trying to be reasonable. It could be, we could have said we want credit for all of those 1,300, but we said, it kind of straddles in time, these two use permits. We will only seek half credit for that. So it's true, it's for our existing students, but the fact is it's creating effective supply next year. With Middle Plaza, again, that was not required. Stanford on other lands. We build housing on a lot of our lands. It's not all focused on this core campus. That's an example of a project where it's taken a long time to entitle. It does take a long time to get housing built, but we've been at it, and the fact is we didn't have to build it. And just like the county is looking at saying Stanford can meet some of this on and off campus, here's an example of an off-campus project that's going to be delivered very soon.
Okay, great. One more question. If a staff member decides they no longer work for Stanford, are they still entitled to stay within Stanford housing?
That's a difficult question, and I don't know that I'm the best person to answer that, but I know that's one of the challenges of providing housing to your workforce.
All right, thank you.
Are there other questions for Catherine? Commissioner Gill?
Thanks, Catherine. Appreciate your commitment from Stanford to go ahead and provide all the mitigation fees and so forth. Stanford is a jewel of the Bay Area, for sure. I don't think the Bay Area would be with what it is without Stanford, and I think everybody can acknowledge that. With the amount of congestion and lack of serviceability for all the residences of California because of the high demand of that, has Stanford ever thought about moving out of this region? It's kind of out of the way, but
yeah. Well, that's an interesting question, and I don't know if we have just recently opened an administrative campus that's in Redwood City. So a lot of our staff, such as myself, that don't need to be actually involved in the mission of teaching or research, is moving to Redwood City, and that's been really the first effort we've had to develop another campus. But when it comes to academics, part of the true brilliance of the work that's done is that close juxtaposition of all the different disciplines. So, that you have medicine talking to engineering, talking to computer science, they're running into each other on campus, and that's where a lot of the great work happens. So there's really a desire to keep the academics all together.
okay, yeah, I can see that. With the influx of all the high tech here in the Bay Area and things of that nature, which a lot has come out of the institution that Stanford has provided, are you aware of any other requirements upon these other industries such as Gilead or Sciences or EA or Facebook or Google to meet what you're being required to provide?
No, we've never seen that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, well, I have
Okay, great.
a question about Escondido Village housing, too. I was on the Architecture and Site Approval Committee when we reviewed that project, and so the plans, and I know that the units, these 2,000 units are all quite small units. They're small studios, a double studio or a single studio, kind of. They're just a room with a bathroom and a little bit, either a little tiny narrow kitchen on a hallway or a slightly larger kitchen area when it's a two-bedroom or two-room unit. So it's a little dormitory-like in my eyes. So my question is, do you have any idea, and you may not, what type of housing would be freed up by students moving into that? Where are they living, and are there lots of them living in, a bunch of people sharing one house, each having a bedroom, people renting a room in a house? So my point is, would they really be freeing up workforce housing, or very much workforce housing?
And first I should say, we should have you out to see the mock-ups of the new rooms at Escondido Village, because they're quite amazing. They're a combination of studio apartments and then small 2 bedrooms and larger 2 bedrooms. But most people that go through them say, I didn't stay in something like this when I was in graduate school. But I don't know how the students are living. There's probably some anecdotal information of sharing a house or, a cottage in the back. I don't really know, and I don't know if we have anyone here that can answer that, but we could certainly get back to you about it. We don't actually know where they live. We know they live generally around the campus, but.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I didn't think you probably would know, but I was just curious to know
thank
what
you.
kind of.
Yeah, sorry, I can't answer that.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I think that is all. So now I'm going to go to speakers. Are there any other people who want to turn in cards? Okay, we just have one more person. So we're still in the limit. So we will have, each speaker has 2 minutes. And I'm going to call a couple names at a time here. The first one I have is Linda Baxter, to be followed by Chad Dutton. And again, you have 2 minutes.
Hi, I'm Linda Baxter. It's kind of scary to be first, but I am a retired teacher, parent, and grandparent, and I've lived in the Bay Area for about 35 years. My husband drugged me up here, kicking and screaming, from Arizona to work in the high-tech industry. And I've watched the community change over years, obviously. Most of you have too. We never had the opportunity to live in the peninsula. It was just out of the question as far as expense went. So we settled in the South Bay. And you may wonder why I'm here, because I live near Los Gatos. But the reason is we're a community. The county is a community, a living being. And when one part of the community is impacted, it impacts the entire community. The people that work at Stanford aren't all the professors that can maybe afford a home up there. There's the gardeners and the people that clean the toilets and the people that cook the food and, supervise the child care, hopefully. They can't afford to live there. And they really can't even afford to live in the South Bay. So they're forced to either maybe live in a camper most of the time, and that happens. There are a lot of people that are living in campers on side streets in places where they have to move every couple of weeks or every couple of days. Or they have to commute to some god-awful place way out into the Central Valley. And that impacts all of us too. I just want to say that I am for the largest amount of housing that you can possibly put up there. Okay? Thanks.
Thank you. So Chad Dutton, to be followed by Anita Enhandit. And I apologize for getting any names wrong here. I'm sure I'm doing it, so.
Good afternoon. My name is Chad Dutton. I'm with the Carpenters, Local 405 out of Santa Clara County. I'm here today to speak in favor of Stanford's General Use Plan. The plan helps create academic housing and the preservation of open space. We all have a responsibility to create a balance between developing habitat and preserving this pristine landscape. Now is the time to have a development agreement attached to Stanford's General Use Plan in order to ensure that all parties involved, that there will be rules governing long-term plans and mutual interests. The development agreement is a binding contractual commitment that helps to bring together the county, the public, and Stanford in order to develop the land responsibly. It is time for the county to meet and collaborate with Stanford in order to achieve a path for development and education. Due to the fact that there is currently no development agreement in place for the Planning Commission to consider, it should delay taking any action until an agreement is implemented. By working together, we can bring development and open space preservation to a fair compromise, and we can do this together responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you. Anita, and I know I've got your last name wrong.
That's quite all right. It's Enander.
Oh, okay.
And I'm a member of the Los Altos City Council. I want, first of all, to thank you and the staff. Prior to being elected to the City Council, I was a member of our Planning Commission. I know how weighty and difficult your job is, and I admire you for tackling this one. I also want to put a face on our letter, which was previously sent to the Board of Supervisors by unanimous consent of our City Council, endorsing the staff recommendation. And I'm really only here today to urge you to move this with your deliberation, but as quickly as possible, to the Board of Supervisors. I'd also like to give you just an anecdotal bit of information about Los Altos really being impacted by what happens at Stanford. And I say this as someone who grew up in this valley and has lived here all my life. 4 years ago, we had the largest multifamily development in our city ever, and the largest addition to our housing stock in decades. And while we had local employees looking forward to moving in there, before the development was completed, it was only 167 units, small by your standards, huge for us. We learned that Stanford was going to lease the entire development. And about 2 years later, Stanford purchased the development. I don't criticize that. I simply want to bring to your attention that the impact extends beyond Palo Alto, and I think it is therefore very meaningful and important that the staff recommendation includes and recognizes that our city is affected, and we appreciate your considering the impact on Los Altos in your deliberations. Again, we hope that you will move quickly through this recommendation and move it on to the Board of Supervisors as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm just trying to get these timers back to 0, I think. Okay, or back to 2. Okay. All right. Roseanne Faust, to be followed by Priya Graves.
Thank you, Chair Schmidt and members of the Commission. My name is Roseanne Faust, and I'm here representing 2 organizations, the San Mateo County Economic Development Association, SAMCEDA, which was founded in 1953. And I'm also here as a former planning commissioner and the former mayor of Redwood City, who successfully negotiated the development agreement with Stanford's Redwood City campus back a few years ago. I want to tell you that it can be done. A development agreement will accomplish all of what you have brought up today, from a conservation easement to additional housing to transportation mitigations to an unbelievable array of community benefits. I received an email this week from a resident in Redwood City. Never met the person before, had no idea who they were, and it said, I just wanted to thank you, because the community benefits that we were able to negotiate through a development agreement included executive education programs, tuition reimbursements, speaker series, and a wide array of things that only an institution like Stanford can provide to a community. The administration in the city of Redwood City has gone through several training programs on the Stanford campus. This is just to name a few things. You have an incredibly hard job. Elected officials, appointed officials, staff, we're all under an amount of pressure now with the housing and transportation situation in the Bay Area that is untenable. But I believe, and I think many of my colleagues and friends believe, that you can negotiate successful community benefits with Stanford University. We encourage you to think about it as a planning commission and also to make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Priya Graves, to be followed by Mandy.
Good afternoon. I want to just touch on a couple of things. First is the question that was in Stanford's revised approach as to where on earth they think they're going to build these houses. They say on Stanford lands outside the core campus. What are we talking about here? Are we talking about the foothills? Are we talking about in the research park? Or are we talking about where they're buying up existing housing, tearing it down, replacing it, whatever, as the previous speaker mentioned, where they bought up a multi-unit development in Los Altos? Second, I wanted to comment on the reverse commute issue. We're told that the new residents have to use their cars to do this, that, and the other thing. Somehow I think we need to think about climate change and our effect on what's happening in the world by using all this oil. Even if you're driving an electric car, the carbon footprint of making that car is huge. And finally, I want to point out that there's a certain irony of Ms. Palter using the term company town, given that they are continuing to buy up my neighborhood and take the houses out of the housing stock for the rest of us. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mandy, to be followed by Karen Cooper.
Hello. I'm glad that you're doing your job to preserve the quality and sustainability of life in our community. I'll write in with more specific comments, but I really wanted to address that for me, for you to prioritize, faculty and staff on campus is an important public benefit, and the workers, ordinary workers, I don't really see the justification for saying that their housing can't be off campus, where they could be located closer to grocery stores and other retail serving areas. And then part of the reason I say this is also, I'm looking at the conditions being imposed on Stanford. I think that a lot of them are good ideas, but when I read things like we need to focus on no new commute trip standard, that the peak hour, that your staff said, focusing the no new commute trip standard on the peak hour has not pushed trips to the shoulder hours or encouraged peak hour spreading. I was surprised, because when I read the conditions F2, A to C, I had thought Stanford must have been in huge violation of the earlier GUP, because those were such tight standards. And I don't view it as, well, they have a long time to set the baseline. I view it as there were that there's a lot of uncertainty created there, and I can see my time's going to run out. I just wanted to tell you that my experience with the faculty and staff at Stanford, I never worked there, I didn't go to school there, I do have a daughter that went there, but I served on the Palo Alto School Board for 8 years, and I can tell you most of the people who live on campus, the faculty, they live there because Stanford's there, and if they weren't there, they would be at some other university. Most people who move to Palo Alto, and studies bear this out, move there for our outstanding public schools. And I wouldn't say we should get rid of the public schools because we'd have less crowding, but there's a difference in the population, just as there's a difference between the reasons why faculty and staff who work different kind of unpredictable hours are better on campus, and we should have worker housing available, but it doesn't have to be on campus. Thank you.
Karen Cooper, you've written down that you represent Stanford University. Is that, if you're representing Stanford University, you should have spoken when Catherine Palter spoke?
I'm a staff member. I'm not representing the university.
Okay, you're not part of the general use permit application?
That's right, I'm not.
Okay, thank you.
So my name is Karen Cooper. I'm the Director of Financial Aid at Stanford. The university has provided some detailed information in its written response to the Commission about our current financial efforts for support of graduate students. Graduate students are a very important part of our community at Stanford, and we undertake extensive efforts to provide financial support for them through a mix of sources. A typical doctoral student at Stanford is offered subsidized housing for a 6-year period, as well as fellowship or assistantship that largely or fully covers their tuition, a stipend for living expenses, and a health insurance premium subsidy. For eligible students, Stanford also provides free transit passes, access to childcare, dependent health care subsidies, and emergency and hardship funding as well. We've been increasing that support in recent years through collaborative discussion with our students, and we're continuing to listen to their concerns and suggestions. I'm available to answer any questions you might have on those topics. Thank you.
Are there any questions? Okay, thank you. Sean McKenna, to be followed by Terry Holzheimer.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Sean McKenna. I represent the Bay Area Council, which is an association of greater than 300 employers from across the region, including Stanford. I spoke at the previous meeting, and I'm here again to continue to provide our support for Stanford and for their GUP application. As I said at the previous meeting, as some of you have said today, Stanford is a treasure and they are a leader. And what does it mean to be a leader? Well, when Stanford writes a Nobel Prize winning physics paper that comes out of their linear accelerator lab, you know, Stanford names are at the front of the paper, but those papers have hundreds of authors. Being a leader means that you are part of a community and that everyone in the community pitches in what they need to do in order to solve a crisis. The Bay Area is in a housing crisis. Los Angeles is in a housing crisis. In Los Angeles, their motto for solving the housing crisis is everyone in. Stanford is not a housing organization. It should not be required to house 100% of the people who work there. Stanford focuses on physics, on science, on everything that they do great, and we think that they can provide some housing units, but we do not believe that they should be forced to provide all of the housing units. And so, as their letter on June 11th to you shows, they are willing to negotiate on that front. And so we believe that the most productive way that you could enter into continued negotiations with Stanford on the exact number of housing units that they will provide is through a development agreement. Using a development agreement, you can maybe correct what was wrong with the 2007 agreement that staff has suggested led to housing units being delayed, and you can ensure that housing is provided before academic space is provided.
Thank you. Terry Holzheimer, to be followed by Cheryl Jensen.
Thank you, Commissioners. I appreciate coming and speaking with you. I spoke with you a couple weeks ago. Maybe you remember me when I was in Palo Alto. I am in full support of the staff report and staff recommendations. I have lived in Palo Alto for more than 25 years. Although Stanford is a wonderful asset to our community, it is also a troublesome neighbor. We've had issues with Stanford for many issues regarding traffic, congestion, housing, all of those issues that are created when you have a large employer, which as Stanford is, in our community. I think that it's very important that the necessary housing that the staff has recommended, the 2,712, I believe, additional housing is essential to our community. In this plan, there's not enough below market rate housing, and we need to devote more of that kind of housing, and Stanford could provide it. I also would support the idea of increasing the affordable housing fees beyond the $20 per square foot of academic space that Stanford has proposed. I think creating more affordable housing fees will help us in terms of growing that end of the housing demand. One more thing I will mention, and that is about the development agreement. I don't think a development agreement is necessary. I think your mission is to look at what has been proposed by the staff, to examine it, to see if it's fair and reasonable, and to vote on it, make the decision on it. I think if a development agreement is put together, I think it needs to be very transparent. The public, especially those communities that are most affected, need to be aware of the details of it. And I hope that it will become, if there is a development agreement, it is made public and is very transparent. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheryl Jensen, to be followed by Peter Dreckmeyer.
I'm Cheryl Jensen. I was a planner in the county when the original use permit was approved. I distinctly remember at that time that was supposed to be the end game, and Stanford had agreed to it, and that was the stake in the ground. And why are they here? I think Stanford is a great institution, and they need to start an off-site campus, and they need to serve people elsewhere. We have just about had it. I go to San Francisco on Tuesdays. I have to come home on 280. I give Stanford half an hour to 40 minutes of my time every Tuesday because you cannot get through it when you get to Page Mill Road. You are just stuck and you're fixed in traffic. Now, all these sayings that we can mitigate this, I don't know how. I don't know how you mitigate that. It's a very wide freeway already, but it's just come to a stop. And you have to think about this when you approve this, because we are already at stop. Not stop and go, stop. Now, the other thing that was very curious to me when you were talking to the Stanford woman who was presenting their ideas, she didn't seem to know about the student housing. Well, that's just absurd. You're talking about worker housing, but what about the student housing? Where are these people living, and where are the new students going to live? We have to address this too. This is part of the reason that we have an environmental review process. We can't just leave out the biggest number here. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Dreckmeyer, to be followed by Alexa Russo.
Good afternoon, Peter Dreckmeyer. I'm a resident and former mayor of Palo Alto. I wanted to thank Commissioner Moore for her interest in pursuing more serious protections of open space. I think that's really important. I hope you all will take that seriously. I also appreciate staff and the consultants' ability to see through the attempt to double count housing. And this issue of getting credit for off-campus housing on Stanford land in other jurisdictions is a fine idea if you also look at the jobs side of it, because the jobs housing imbalance is one of supply but also demand. And the Stanford West departments on Sand Hill Road in Palo Alto that sometimes are referenced are 640 units, and right across the street at the hospital, they're going through a massive expansion that's going to bring 2,000 employees. I just looked up the Middle Plaza project, and using the square foot to employee ratio, I calculated 550 employees, but only 212 housing units. And then when you look at the Stanford Research Park and the Stanford Shopping Center, very, very little housing. I'm the policy director for the Tuolumne River Trust. I sent you a letter last week about the water supply assessment, and obviously I can't go into a lot of detail right now, but I do want to be available for any questions. That was revised in 2017, and things have changed since then. Most notably, the State Water Board adopted higher inflow stream standards. And the SFPUC, which provides water for wholesale customers like Stanford, but also retail customers within San Francisco, they had to revise all of their water supply assessments and acknowledge that we don't really know how much water we're going to have available, but it could be up to 50% rationing. So the water supply assessment for the general use permit has to be updated and in accordance with what the SFPUC is saying. We don't agree with their analysis, but that's what they're saying. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, Alexa Russo to be followed by Shelby Parks.
Good afternoon, Planning Commissioners. My name is Alexa Russo, and I'm here to represent the Stanford Solidarity Network. I also will make a quick comment on behalf of the Stanford Coalition for the Planning on an Equitable 2035. First, on behalf of SSN, I do wish to reiterate from the last hearing that we are deeply concerned that the very few graduate student COA recommendations have entered into the county's draft COAs. As the development agreement seems less and less likely to happen, graduate student worker concerns run the risk of getting lost in the GUP process. At this time, we wish to make clear to the Commission that graduate student worker affordability is necessary to comply with existing county policy. Within the Stanford Community Plan, policy approved by the county in 2000, there's very clear explicit mention that Stanford's graduate student worker housing be made affordable for graduate student workers. To quote county policy, sub-strategy 1C, entitled Augment Affordable Programs and Funding, the policy states, for housing to meet the needs of its target population, its price must be consistent with the income of the intended residents. Housing can be considered affordable by accepted regulatory agencies, but can still be too expensive for specific populations. The policy then makes clear that graduate student workers are one of these specific populations. The COAs provide an important opportunity for the county to ensure adherence to this important policy. Also, as a quick comment on behalf of Scope 2035 and housing for workers who are not students, Stanford has mentioned that they could bring more affordable housing sooner with a development agreement, but has proposed an example scenario in which they would build less housing in exchange. This is exactly the type of transaction that would weaken the project and COAs in a way that would only be detrimental to the community and to the housing crisis. The Commission should be wary of this when considering the DA.
Thank you. Shelby Parks to be followed by Tim McKenzie.
Hi, I'm Shelby, and I'll be speaking on behalf of Stanford Coalition for Planning an Equitable 2035. We're here to say that the Stanford student body will not accept anything but full mitigation from the new Stanford General Use Permit. At the previous hearing, Stanford talked about how they've surveyed campus workers and reported that they do not want housing on campus. As an acclaimed academic institution, it's hypocritical and unreasonable for Stanford to make selective conclusions about a piece of research that they refuse to release to the public. The university has been asked to release these data in the past, and the fact that they still conceal the survey suggests that they have something to hide or that the true results are not to Stanford's liking. In contrast, all of the county's details and analyses have been made fully public. We've learned through our conversations with SEIU Local 2007 that the few workers who do live in university-supplied housing attest to the fact that they get to spend more time with their children and benefit from services and conveniences associated with the nearby housing. We encourage the Planning Commission staff to reach out to Stanford workers, and by workers I mean ones who aren't on Stanford's PR team, and ask them if they want affordable housing on and near campus. Additionally, Stanford stated that the conditions of approval are infeasible and unreasonably extensive. The county administration put together well-researched, robust conditions of approval that match the anticipated impacts of the proposed development. If Stanford sincerely believes that the mitigation measures are too burdensome for them as such a powerful developer, that is a sign that the project proposal is going to cause too much damage to the community, not that the county is unjustified in requiring adequate mitigation. We're concerned about Stanford's rhetoric, and we will be sending you a detailed response to the university's recent letters, including their conditions of approval counteroffer. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker is Tim McKenzie, and then I think I'm going to take a short break after that. We've got a few more speakers, but take a real short break. I don't know if any commissioners need to move their cars. That's typically something that needs to happen about this time. So after Tim, we'll just take a short break so people can move cars, etc. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Tim McKenzie. I was recently a graduate student worker in the chemistry department, and I'm about to start working as a postdoctoral researcher in the genetics department at Stanford. I'm here as a representative of the Stanford Solidarity Network. We would like to make clear to the Commission that including affordable housing for graduate student workers in the COAs is necessary for the county's goal of full mitigation. If Stanford housing is made even more unaffordable for graduate student workers, we will increasingly apply for Section 8 housing off campus, which most of us qualify for since we are financially independent and depend on the low income we receive from Stanford. In fact, in Stanford's recently released protocols for its community associates, graduate student workers who are employed to help their colleagues in graduate housing, the university instructs community associates to direct graduate student workers in financial difficulties to government programs, explicitly externalizing the costs of failure to provide affordable housing for graduate student workers onto the county. In light of the potential cost of the county and relevant county policies explicitly on affordable graduate worker housing, it is imperative that the county ensure that new housing units approved in the GUB be made affordable. But to do this, we ask that the county perform and make publicly available the results of a nexus study to determine the appropriate pricing levels based on actual graduate student worker incomes, which Stanford does not make publicly available. We further request that the results of this study are explicitly considered in the final conditions of approval, and we'll be submitting a formal written response to the county draft conditions of approval. And just as a note, as a graduate student, I've lived in a house in Mountain View that I've been sharing with two other people since 2015. It's the same cost as the supposedly below market housing on Stanford's campus, and I know people who have been living in vans during their time there.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 8 more speakers, but again, let's just take a short break. People get back as quickly as you can. Thanks. Get going again here. We've got some more public speakers. And the next one I have is Stephen Turner, to be followed by Alejandro Martinez.
Thank you, Commissioners. I'm Stephen Turner, the Acting Community Development Director for the City of Redwood City. Thanks for the opportunity to address the Commission regarding your consideration of the general use permit. My comments today are submitted on behalf of the City, and in particularly Vice Mayor Dan Howard and Councilmember Janet Borgens, who couldn't be here today. Stanford and the City recently celebrated the opening of the first phase of the Stanford and Redwood City project, which brought 2,700 Stanford employees to Redwood City in a beautiful and modern campus near our downtown. This accomplishment, of course, didn't happen overnight, but took many years of discussions, negotiations, and planning, and construction to realize the shared vision between Stanford and Redwood City. It is also in the spirit of partnership that Redwood City has collaborated with our neighboring cities and San Mateo County to generally support the conditions of approval and the community plan amendments as drafted by Santa Clara County staff. We ask that the Planning Commission consider the regional nature of the requested general use permit, which would extend impacts beyond the Santa Clara County line. Redwood City is a co-signer of the May 29, 2019 letter from San Mateo County that requests considerations and amendments that would represent a starting point for further discussions with our partner cities and in San Mateo County. Key considerations include a mandate for housing within 6 miles of campus, prohibit increases in traffic congestion and trips during commute and non-commute hours, and preparation of a community service study to assess the costs of services on municipal service providers and other local agencies. Stanford has demonstrated their commitment to Redwood City and other local communities in the past, and we hope that this spirit of communication will grow between Stanford and San Mateo County through this general use permit process. Thank you.
Thank you. Alejandro Martinez, to be followed by Jose Mexicano.
Good evening. My name is Alejandro Martinez, and I am a Santa Clara County resident. I'm here because I am in favor of the Stanford expansion with the housing. Mostly I'm here for my family, my community, and my local union, 270. This will bring good livable wages and work for Santa Clara County residents, and with benefits for all those the community in the Santa Clara County. Thanks to those projects, those expansions, I'm able to afford a home for my family and be able to live without worrying about where am I supposed to be. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Jose Mexicano, to be followed by Olivia Navarro.
Good evening. My name is Jose Mexicano, and I am a Laborers International Union rep, and I'm here representing close to 5,000 members. I have quite a few here. Please stand. We're here and in support of the project. Hopefully you guys could also support this project because it'll bring good paying jobs to our community, in which right now, and especially in this in this economy we live in, we need that work, and we need to get more work for all our guys out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
And for the audio version, at least 10 ladies and gentlemen stood up behind him.
Okay, so Olivia Navarro, to be followed by Ruben Navarro.
Yes, thank you. A little bit more than 10. We have a couple of kids back there.
Okay.
So I just want to recognize them. Thank you very much, Commissioners, for taking the time to review this. My name is Olivia Navarro, and I am also here representing Liuna Local 270, the laborers. They are what we call pico pala, the hard workers. They're the ones that build Santa Clara County. And I am proud to tell you that today, as they stood, and I'm not going to make them stand again, there's close to 5,000 members, family members, workers, and parents, children. Their families live and would love to work here and continue to work here. Today we stand before you requesting that you support Stanford's. I saw that today, or earlier this week, they submitted a proposal changing and getting the 2,172 housing units. So to me, that's favorable. They are trying to open up the lines of communication and trying to work in collaboration and be a good neighbor. Stanford is not a gem of the county. I would say it's the diamond of the county. I mean, really, when people think about Santa Clara County and Stanford, they've been a monumental part of the county, showing our eclectic minds over generations. So I would hope that you guys consider passing the general use plan, communicating with Stanford and with the residents, and knowing that when you provide this, you're also providing opportunities for our neighboring families to continue to live and thrive in this community, and hopefully their children can also attend Stanford University. And I thank you for your time, since I'm running out.
Thank you. Ruben Navarro, to be followed by Devin Ryan.
Hello, Commissioners. I want to make sure that I'll let everyone know here that I am not speaking on behalf of the City of San Jose Housing and Community Development Commission. I am a commissioner, but I want to make it clear that I came here to speak as myself, just a statement. I'm here to request a federal recommendation to the Board of Supervisors for the Stanford University General Use Plan. The reason I'm here to support this is that we know how hard any type of housing it is to get built. We had the group of homeless that were just staying here down the road, and how impossible it was to find a new location for a tent city. So it's very hard to just find a physical location to put housing in. So I came here to embrace this project because any organization that's happened to put any type of dent on our housing stock, it is a good thing. We definitely, the sooner we can move forward with this project, the sooner we can start adding housing units to the much well-needed stock of housing that we need in this county. Also, I want to speak on the behalf that on the reverse commute item that was being brought up a couple times, I was honored to participate in a leadership program at Stanford. Stanford actually did provide housing for us, so we wouldn't have to commute. I could tell you this, that someone that lives in San Jose, to commute to Stanford is one of the biggest headaches that you have to sit for in traffic. But being at Stanford and participating in leadership programs and being able to commute from Stanford to other locations is a lot easier. So I could totally see how this would definitely alleviate some of the traffic congestions and help reduce commute times for many people. So again, I would highly recommend that this commission move with this project as quickly as possible. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Devin Ryan, to be followed by Francisco Preciado.
Thank you. I'm Devin Ryan, and I live in the Stanford Faculty Staff Housing Company town. And I'm concerned at how little the commission and county staff seem to understand how it works. First, speaking of paying our fair share, I want to make it clear that we pay fair market value property taxes. For me, $30,000 a year. I think about 45% of that goes to Palo Alto schools that I don't use because I don't have kids, and that's about 3 times what the average resident pays thanks to Prop 13. My husband's a faculty member, and to answer Bob Levy's question, at least in our case, if he were to stop working at Stanford, we would indeed lose our home. Also, on Schmidt's question, anecdotally, the grad students I know housed off campus are in regular apartments now, and moving them, I assume, would free up regular apartments. Now, I feel very grateful for my ability to live within an hour of my job, and Stanford housing is not right for everyone. Having housing options off campus is critical. Make no mistake, some of the negative externalities do factor in having your landlord be your employer, even employers as great as Stanford. And now we're going to ask company town spouses who don't work at Stanford to never drive anywhere, ever. The county can't have the narrative that it is trying to increase housing while engineering that housing will not be built because of requirements that are physically and sociologically impossible to meet. Stanford staff housing is actually a very, very complicated issue, more complicated than I think is being understood here. I urge the county to enter into a development agreement with Stanford to talk through these issues and externalities so something can be created that will work for everyone. And on a separate note, you cannot separate Stanford, the education and research institution, from Stanford's development. To find cures for disease, you don't just need students and professors, you need labs, storage space, offices, classrooms. Unlike for-profit companies with thousands of employees in the region who are not being asked to meet these requirements, Stanford's mission is to educate and benefit humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. Francisco Preciado, to be followed by Hal Mickelson, and Hal's is the last card that I have.
Hi, Commissioners. My name is Francisco Preciado. I'm the Executive Director for SCIU Local 2007. I'm here to bring attention to two issues in Stanford's letter to the Commission dated June 10th. So in response to Commissioner Resendez's comments or questions, Stanford references the Stanford Living Wage Policy, and it implies that it applies to all service workers. But as a former student who helped push Stanford adopt the policy because they fought students and workers on actually adopting the living wage policy to begin with, I'm actually aware that there's a specific exception, and that's that it excludes tenants or other entities doing business on Stanford-owned land. This includes Stanford Hospital, clinics, and Lucille Packard Children's Hospital. The second point is regarding Stanford's response to the commissioners that their Affordability Task Force survey shows workers don't want on-campus housing. The service and technical workers that we represent were specifically excluded from that survey. We think that would have a different, it would show something different than what Stanford claims. It probably also excludes, the survey also probably excludes contracted service workers like the janitorial staff, which work on the campus and are represented by our sister local, USWW. Thank you.
Thank you. Hal Mickelson.
Good afternoon. I'm Hal Mickelson. I'm a retiree living in the Palo Alto area. On July 10, 12th, and 13th, the symphony from San Francisco will be playing in Frost Amphitheater. It's a return to a tradition from 25 or 30 years ago in which the Frost Amphitheater on the Stanford campus was used for open-air concerts. Neighbors of Stanford in Palo Alto and Menlo Park and Los Altos just love this idea. But guess what? If you have a measure of traffic on the Stanford campus that penalizes Stanford for inviting its neighbors to come onto the campus for cultural events, you're discouraging Stanford for something that's very wholesome. Similarly, if you want to have worker families living on the Stanford campus, the children in the worker families are going to have to go to their orthodontist appointments and their soccer matches. They're going to have to get there in some way. If you have a reverse commute measure that is unrealistic in terms of situating workers in housing on campus, again, you're treating Stanford unfairly. The big picture is that Stanford's housing proposals merit serious and urgent collaborative consideration between the university and the county to determine what's feasible and reasonable, followed by full public evaluation. Stanford is in a position to get some housing built, and perhaps built more quickly than some other alternatives. Remember that number 1437. That's 2 years worth of the county's efforts to get housing units built. It puts some of the numbers that Stanford is talking about in perspective. Stanford has a wonderful story to tell. 97% of undergraduates live on campus. 65% of graduate students live on campus. It's a negotiation that should go forward successfully. Thank you.
Thank you. I have no more cards, but if Stanford would like to have 5 minutes for a response, Stanford is welcome to do so.
Thank you. Just to return to a couple of the questions that were asked, going back to the reverse commute direction, the staff told you that, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're
we're
signaling to
getting,
her.
5 minutes on the.
Okay. Staff mentioned there were 3 reasons that they thought the reverse commute direction standard would be fine. The first was that it doesn't include any of the development that we're already authorized to build under this general use permit. I mean, that just makes sense. I mean, this was for the future development, so that's not really an issue. The second was the 2% threshold, which we already talked about. The third one was that this issue was never raised when we added Escondido Village to campus. And that's true, because it's a very different demographic. Escondido Village is for single graduate students, a small amount of married students, and no children. So they have a very different, set of trips. So they really can't be compared. It's not inconsistent that we wouldn't be concerned about reverse commute with Escondido, and we are with faculty staff. With regard to the average daily trips, we've talked about the disincentivized housing. It has it's a problem if we want to encourage people to come to campus, but they also noted it includes the cut-through traffic. So if any reason there's any sort of issues that are causing more cut-through traffic than occurs today, that would be a problem and would stop Stanford's academic development. So, then Stanford would have to essentially prevent that cut-through traffic, which would have incredible results of gridlock around the campus because a lot of people just drive through the campus to use it as a transportation network. With regard to Escondido Village and the role it plays in this, just so you're aware, we were developing the application for Escondido at the same time we were developing the application for this process, believe it or not. It was back in 2016. And we thought at that time, should we make this part of the 2018 GUP? And because we know we're going to want to propose some housing in that, and we decided no. Let's expedite this and get these apartments open as quickly as we can under the approvals under the last GUP, and then also propose more housing in this future GUP. And just also note that the Nexus study that was developed did not take into consideration the fact that we were going to be building Escondido Village graduate residences or the Middle Plaza project in Ludlow Park. There was just a comment about the survey that Stanford conducted. My understanding is that some of the technical workers were not involved because we're not allowed to survey represented workers about any of those items. They are a small amount of workers. They're very important to us, but we don't think that it would substantially change the results we have in our survey. Commissioner Levy also asked about phasing, and I just want to clarify, because I'm not sure if I was really clear, that we think it makes sense as a place to step back as long as we're starting from a place where the conditions are feasible. If the conditions aren't feasible, essentially what's happening is you're saying if we accept these conditions for the housing, we'd finish our first phase of academic and we would not be able to move forward because of that housing we built that cannot be mitigated. So essentially we have no incentive to front load the housing because we're not going to be able to finish our academic development. So just finishing, we encourage the Planning Commission to consider all the changes that we suggested to facilitate the delivery of even more workforce housing. We note that earlier Deputy Executive Gallegos mentioned the development agreement was suspended until it's strategically advantageous to negotiate for the county. We hope this means that their recommendation to deny the development agreement application is not firm. We realize that the county has not negotiated a development agreement in their 169-year history, but is what is done for large projects in all the cities around us, and Stanford has successfully negotiated many. You heard the results of our partnership with Redwood City. We encourage you to direct staff to talk to Stanford at least about a framework for a development agreement so you can understand the benefits that we want to provide to the community as part of this effort. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions for Catherine Palter right now? I don't see any. Thank you very much. All right. I will close the public hearing and come back to the commission and to staff. Does staff have a few comments here?
Yes, thank you, Chair Schmidt. Jeff Bradley, Project Manager. I just wanted to clarify that we are not asking the commission to make a recommendation on any of these items today, for the simple reason that we are still working on the findings for the CEQA portion, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, and related to that is another document called the Statement of Overriding Considerations that is also necessary to comply with the CEQA regulations. But I think that concludes my comments, unless there's any specific questions for staff. Thank you.
I think that we also are anticipating that we'll come back to the next meeting and staff will have reviewed all of Stanford's comments and in the conditions of approval.
Yes.
And I know we've had your basic comments on their proposal, but you may have additional ones. So, but we would expect your thinking on Stanford's proposed changes to the conditions of approval.
Correct, and I just wanted to clarify that we will have everything in place for your next meeting, your next scheduled meeting on June 27th, where you will have all the information available to you to be able to make recommendations to the board on all of the items on the listed on the agenda.
Okay, and then I think one more thing, I should have perhaps asked Stanford about this, but I think Stanford has said that they have not yet made their comments on the community plan, and that those will be hopefully coming in soon, so that we can be reviewing them for the next meeting. Commissioner Resendez, I think we can have a discussion, and any more questions for staff at this time?
Yes, I have a question for staff. You know, you're going to be looking for more findings, but how are you on the negotiations? If the Stanford is getting closer to negotiate something, how closer is the county to negotiate the agreement? Or Sylvia?
Sylvia Geigs, Deputy County Executive. As I indicated before, currently the development agreement negotiations are suspended. And if they were to occur in the future, it would be, as I said at the time, that would be most advantageous to us from a negotiation standpoint. And so what we're saying is, what you have before you is the permit application. If in fact in the future the county does negotiate and recommend a development agreement to the Board of Supervisors, all of this would come back to the Planning Commission for review.
But,
you would have that opportunity in the future.
Yeah, I'm looking this as a business person. You know, if I got another business partner that doesn't want to negotiate or come up to the table, I just get tired and go to the next one. Because also it's expensive sometimes with, it's like Stanford coming with this proposal, spending all this money in all these meetings, and then you say the negotiations stop. There gotta be a time when you guys get closer to negotiate and closer to deal with all the issues that we have.
So let me, I feel the need to clarify, because it seems as if in the public's mind that they are conflating a development agreement negotiation, which is two parties reaching agreement, and conflating it with what this is, which is a regulatory process by which we are reviewing a permit application and recommending conditions. They're separate, somewhat parallel processes. We're not certain whether we may in the future enter into and possibly reach a development agreement. So what I'm saying is, for the moment, the job before the Planning Commission is to review and make recommendations on this permit application. And that if you feel satisfied at the June 27th meeting that you have all of the information that is necessary to make a recommendation, we are encouraging you to do so. And as I said, if later we do negotiate an agreement, that will come back to the Planning Commission as well as this package. And you can see if there are impacts with respect to the conditions of approval. And then you can compare it to the permit application and the approvals and the conditions that we have before you now. And then you have the ability to compare that versus what may be negotiated in a DA, where we get community benefits. But importantly, you get benefits when you make concessions, particularly on important community protections. So we're going to have to evaluate that, as you will, whether on balance that makes sense. But we're not there in the process. So again, what you have before you is the permit application to review and recommend.
So there is not a deadline, so we're going to continue with doing those meetings? Or?
I'm sorry?
Is a deadline? The deadline is going to be the end of this month, or?
There's no deadline per se as we move along the process, because the next step would then be to present this to the board. There may be an opportunity then.
Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Rouser, did you want to?
Yeah, I appreciate those comments. Over time, all of us have stated our we want to encourage a development agreement, and I think it, like you stated, it does provide some outside-the-box opportunities. Having said that, at this point, we have to, as a planning commission, we've got to look at this and decide what is the best thing for our county, and we have to keep that process moving along, not too quickly, not too slowly, just enough so that we feel like we have the right information and we can make a decision. And I apologize for stating the obvious, but it was confusing to me when the county started negotiating and we're reading stuff in the paper, and it's like, well, if they're going to be trying that, then let's see what happens. And so now, as I'm learning more and more, I'm just realizing that at this point, that would be great if something happens, but right now we got to do our best to get the information we need. And for me, I just appreciate all the public comments. We learned a lot from those comments, and it raises a lot of issues that we weren't aware of. And so I just, again, want to thank you. Many of you have been to just about every one of these, and so you're really doing your best to make this the best agreement that you guys can do on that. So I want to say thank you. And I do want to recognize Stanford provides a lot of good benefits for this area, and many of the other planning commissioners have stated that too. And we could be here for hours and hours and hours going through all that. So I do want to acknowledge Stanford's like I said, benefits in the community. What I would like to do is just kind of suggest we have at least one more meeting, and there's some areas that I know we're doing kind of fact-finding, so we ask questions here and questions there, but I'd like to just encourage some of the planning commissioners to start to just kind of identify what are the areas that you think need to be improved, what are the areas that you feel comfortable with, and then as the staff comes up with different recommendations and everything, we can decide, do we need to give them some direction in certain areas, or is this something that we're comfortable with the plan that's right, but the recommendation that's there before us. So I just want to kind of throw that out as a possible direction that we're moving to. At the end of the day, I'd like to see this agreement to be something that provides certainty to the applicant, but it is also flexible. So if we're talking 20, 30 years, or in some cases 99 years, in my mind, we're not going to get it right on every little thing. So there has to be some places where there can be a little bit of an adjustment along the way, but it can't be so loose that the applicant wouldn't be able to move forward on certain things. So I just want to put that as two of my priorities: flexibility and certainty. And the areas that I am a little bit concerned is the whole agreement with the 99 years with 4/5 vote, and they can, with a 50% majority, they can get rid of that. And so at that point, why don't we make it 150 years? Why don't we make it 500 years? I mean, at this point, let's all feel good and just realize that that's nothing. I have some concerns on the whole housing landlord thing. Some of that stuff is outside of our area. I don't know that we can make recommendations on how much they can charge for this or that, and so I'm still, before the next meeting, I'd still like to, I read all those neighborhood letters on things, on the different lot sizes, and Stanford supposedly buying stuff up, letting it deteriorate, and saying, oh, we need to get rid of that stuff and rebuild on it. I'm unclear as a planning commissioner what's within our ability to help solve that. Certainly when they ask for governance, I've been part of the SIMPAC committee for almost 2 decades, and that's a land use advisory. So if you're hoping that there's some kind of, that's your government representative, that isn't that way with SIMPAC. We bring up all kinds of issues that the Planning Commission can't deal with because it's not within our jurisdiction. So I don't know that a SIMPAC, it could help in land use issues, but it doesn't help solve if you're looking for literally a representative government at a more local level. And then just the last thing is I'm still trying to wrap my head around the staff, not the faculty, but the staff people living on campus versus, and then having the whole families come on, and then having, do we have to discourage them from driving off campus to make those appointments? That whole thing, I'm still, I'm not understanding. I put out some queries earlier on, in lieu fee or something like that. To me, that just, it may not be the end all, but it certainly is a lot more flexible in allowing different kinds of solutions to arise. And right now, if you do a traffic in lieu fee and that's supposed to go to a particular intersection, and the city of Palo Alto says, you know what, we actually got one that's way worse, we'd like to spend that money there in the saving of the environment and the Palo Alto residents, maybe that's the right decision for them to make. So again, I want to keep it as flexible as possible in these types of things. So sorry for talking so long, but that's my comments.
No, thank you. Would other commissioners like to make some comments or questions? Commissioner Levy.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Rausser. I'm in concert with your thinking as well, to a large extent. And I also want to thank both Stanford and staff. I think you guys have done a great job of your due diligence of representing your specific interests and making sure we're going to get the best project possible. I think we still have a little bit of room to go to make sure to get to the end. But I want to thank you both for what you've been doing up to this point in time. There's a couple of things that I'm particularly interested in as well. One is, as I mentioned before, the nexus between the reverse commutes and the average daily commutes, average daily trips. I'm still not 100% sure on how that nexus should play out, or how, as Stanford's mentioned on a couple times, if we don't have a significant impact for one of these things, is that something that needs to be addressed or something we need to plan for in the future, because we may end up have cumulative impacts that end up being significant in the future, and then we need to make sure that they pay their fair share. But I'm not sure we're there yet on the fair share portion of that. The 70% housing on site is another thing that I'm not 100% sure of at this point in time. There was our speaker from Los Altos, previous council member, mayor, who said they just bought an apartment building. And we had an apartment building that was meant for, providing housing, and then Stanford just came out and bought it. And so a question for staff is, if that happens in the future, is that something that can be credited towards providing housing, or does all the housing units that need to be provided in the future have to be additional housing units above and beyond what currently exists in the market? Because I'd like to make sure that, that if Stanford does have to provide housing, they're just not taking something that currently exists and buying it and then crediting it to them, and then we end up losing those housing units elsewhere. One of the things that has come up on the last couple of meetings that I haven't heard anything about, and that is the historic nature of the existing neighborhoods. I know that the neighbors are concerned. I'm not sure, how important that is, but we haven't heard back from staff on that, so I'd like to hear that. And then finally, Stanford's document, the 131-page document that we spent a couple nights studying and comparing it back to the plans and so forth. They had some points that were valid. They're very valid. So I would like to see a written response from staff, if that's possible, before, at least 2 or 3 days before our next meeting, so we have time to study it. Going through each one of those items and responding. I mean, there's some places in their document where they're saying, well, this doesn't conform with old plans. This is new and it doesn't conform, and we don't know where that is. They want to knock columns off the tables. We don't know if that's legit. There's a whole series of items in there. I probably wrote down 30 of them where I wasn't sure which direction to go on it. So I'm hoping that we see staff's recommendation on those recommendations from Stanford.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Moore.
Great. So, yeah, I agree with what's been said so far. I was going to bring up the more information about the San Juan neighborhoods, the lower density neighborhoods, and what's happening at the county level to address some legitimate concerns. I understand something is happening. I also wanted to ask if there could be a staff response to the Tuolumne River Trust letter in regards to the need for a new water supply assessment and how that impacts the process. I also would like to see some response to the Stanford Community Plan. It's called the sub-strategy under housing. It was to augment affordability programs and funding. To what extent that this describes the need to make graduate student housing affordable to the target population. So I would like to know what role the county has or doesn't have in implementing this sub-strategy. It's on page 52 of the Stanford Community Plan. I thought those were some very good points. It would be helpful, one of the issues that came up was the need for a municipal services study, and Stanford had some concerns about that in great detail relating to a whole array of municipal services, which include childcare and included parks. And it would be helpful to have some background of where that recommendation originated from. Was it the 1985 Joint Land Use Agreement, or were there some other, just what was the impetus for that? And let's see, 2 other items would be, I just wanted clarification in terms of the bird safe design and lighting. If the recommendations going before the county this fall would actually potentially apply to Stanford? Is it a timing issue? Or, okay, yeah, because I think it should apply to Stanford. I wasn't satisfied with either responses from Stanford or staff saying, oh, well, there really isn't a problem, because I don't think there's, anyway, I have had some conversations with the Audubon Society, and I actually think that they put forward some very good recommendations that could very well be applied to Stanford, and they have been applied to many municipalities through various mandatory guidelines or other requirements, including the county, including cities, and I think it could apply to Stanford. And then last but not least, there's still my concern about the ability to remove very old oak trees. Was not actually addressed as a response to my previous comments, so I would like to look into inquiry whether oak trees what was proposed that are deemed to be about 140 years or older could be potentially prohibited from removal based on the criteria that were provided by a couple of the letters that were submitted. The comments that were addressed only had to do with replacement ratios, but did not actually address the issue of whether very old oak trees should be allowed to be removed at all. So those are some of my thoughts, and going forward, I'd like to see some of those addressed, or all of those addressed, rather.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other commissioners? Commissioner Gill.
I wanted to go ahead and thank everybody for making a presentation too, in terms of their thoughts on this process from staff as well as Stanford and the community. Thank you so much for taking the time to come down here and present your point of view in terms of these issues of housing, transportation, and open space. It's a very complex problem we're looking at right here. And from a planning perspective, I don't have a very deep background in that, but I'm getting versed in this very quickly as I possibly can. So I want to thank staff for bringing me along with this whole adventure, as well as Stanford as well. Some comments that I have from coming outside of this and looking at this from an outsider's perspective in terms of what's going on with the Bay Area is that we're faced with a Class A problem. A Class A problem being we are growing and growing very quickly without the resources to go ahead and provide for these areas for a quality of life issues. And we're stealing these resources from other areas. And if it's gentrification you want to talk about, that might be the way to go ahead and look at these things. So it's not easy in terms of trying to mitigate all the effects of growth. And I don't suspect that we will able to go ahead and mitigate all effects going to 2035 with this GUP program. But I want to go ahead and say it's a heck of an effort to go ahead and try to bring this to fruition. The development agreement between Stanford and the county can be very useful, I believe. Obviously, that's in the offset from this. But I would welcome any more information that can be shared with myself as a commissioner in terms of what Stanford's done in terms of trying to alleviate transportation issues, whether that's through local Amtrak services, Caltrain services, bus services, or whatever it might be, to go ahead and reflect upon this conversation as to how we best come to a position of trying to alleviate all the pain and suffering that might be going through our community. So again, I want to say thank you for your time and efforts in this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Moore?
I forgot one thing. I brought it up earlier, but I'd like the additional information on, given that it only takes a 3/5 vote to change the policy that requires the 4/5 vote for the academic growth boundary changes, if that revelation, if it was a revelation to some, makes any difference in terms of recommendations for other means to preserve high-quality natural resource areas in the foothills outside the academic growth boundary. I'd like some response to that.
Okay, and any other comments here? Okay. I think most of my thoughts have been covered here too. We've got a large, complicated issue here, and I also want to thank Stanford and staff for all of the work that they have done to thoroughly evaluate all possibilities that we can think of now, and I do want to thank the public for coming and sharing their thoughts with us. As noted, this is a very big and complex issue, and I hope we can come up with a good agreement about what needs to go forward to the Board of Supervisors. The housing, transportation, and the open space, those are the big things, but a lot of detail involved in them. So I look forward to our next meeting and hearing some more from staff and having some more time to think about things. I have been told by council that if we have small things like typos, it would be best to mention them in an open forum like this. So I know Commissioner Moore has a couple, and I have a couple of little tiny typos that if it's in a final legal document, it would be good to have it correct. So.
Okay, yeah, so I'm hoping I'm getting all the page numbers correct, but page 23 of the conditions of approval, This is pertaining to the reverse commute and the average daily commute. It states the word "or," and I think what it means is "and." It was saying AM or PM trips, and I'm guessing it means AM and PM trips. So that, I mean, I could be wrong on that, but that's my sense of, because it appears to address both AM and PM in all the presentations. So that was more of a very substantive one. And just let's see, a very minor one on page 284 of the, oh my God, I think it's the community plan. The map shows the Stanford Stadium on the map as being older than 50 years, and of course the new stadium is much younger than that, so that, I don't know if that just needs to be addressed. On page 323 at the top of the page of the Stanford Community Plan, there's a phrase that says greenhouse gas emissions that are consumed, and I think what they want is the term emit, the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. Let me see if there's anything else. A few of them are just really, really minor. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Commissioner Moore, sorry, what was the page number for the greenhouse gas consumption?
I have it at page 323, the first paragraph of the, I believe that's in the Stanford Community Plan. Oh, 323 was in the packet page. That's why it's a little confusing. Yeah. So it's a different page number for the actual community plan. Yeah.
Okay. And I have two tiny little typos in the conditions of approval on page 38 of the actual conditions. Item number 5, it says the San Francisco dusty-footed wood rat, and it's the dusky, D-U-S-K-Y. And on page 84 of the COAs, there's a table. The third item down, it says Middleton Road and Embarcadero Road. It's Middlefield Road and Embarcadero Road. And those are my little tiny typos.
Thank you, Chairperson Schmidt. City of Palo Alto seconds the motion on the middle field
Okay.
correction.
Okay. Are there any other comments today? And if not, we will be continuing this to our next meeting on June 27th here at 1:30 in the afternoon. And so I'll look forward to that. And now I want to adjourn to that next regular meeting on Thursday, June 27th, 2019 at 1:30 p.m. at the Isaac Newton Center Auditorium, County Government Center, 70 West Heading Street, San Jose. Thank you all.